Okay, so for this video, we're gonna do a business video, and basically, the reason I'm doing this because I was not always, but I was thinking. Oh wait, did I messed this up? I did mess this up. All right, it's better now. So I was thinking on the SkyTrain on my way to my university, UBC. What do you do as two independent parties to make sure that if you're like making a deal with the other party and the other party is not meeting all the way with your requirements, uh, how you can how can you make it fair? How should you make it fair? Is it something to be mentioned before the negotiations and the deal, or is it something that's implied, or I don't know, but it seems very important. So sometimes like they do 50% in the beginning, 50% at the end. But for the contractor, what if they just don't pay 50%, the other 50%? Do you not just work with them? Is it credibility? Is it trust? Uh, how uh, how can you basically measure trust and credibility? All right, so this is like someone's son, this is a friend for 5 years. So there are like different parameters that I thought about, but I hope I can make it a little bit more concrete and organized. And hopefully, by the end of this video, I have some idea that um, basically I can just cash it without thinking about it when it comes to when there comes a scenario that there is a deal negotiation or employment salary or anything. Uh, so I can show competency, or you can show competency, because it's really important to be fast on your feet and all that. All right, so Deal Making 2.0, A Guide to Complex Negotiations by David A. Lax and James K. Sebenius. So let's do the routine. David A. Lax. He's an American author, education Harvard, program on negotiation at Harvard Law School. And James K. Sebenius. James K. Sebenius. James K. Sebenius is an American economist, currently the Gordon Donaldson Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business, as well as co-founder and partner of Lax Sebenius, Good HNX. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the standard is for a business school, but let's just read a little bit more about this guy. James is the Gordon Donaldson Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School, where he founded the negotiation unit and teaches advanced negotiation to graduate students and senior executives. He also directs the Harvard Negotiation Project at Harvard Law School, where he serves as vice chair for practice-focused research, with co-author David Lax, Gym-Oriented 3D Negotiation, a unique, powerful approach for analyzing and developing strategy for complex negotiations. He co-founded Lax Sebenius LLC, an active firm that offers negotiation advice to companies and governments worldwide. Sebenius' private sector career has also included with the Blackstone Group. In the private sector, he served in the U.S. government, Commerce, and State Department. Pretty heavy. All right, so there's a summary which maybe can be useful. Most big deals, mega mergers, major sales, infrastructure projects are built on a series of smaller ones. Each component deal each component deal presents a tactical challenge, but sequencing the parts in a way that achieves the target outcome is a strategic challenge that can unfold over months or years. This process, which the author call a negotiation campaign, must generally be conducted on several fronts, each involving multiple parties. A multi-front campaign can be much more effective than direct negotiation. After failed talks between longshoremen and the Pacific Maritime Association, a group of shippers and port operators, the PMA's president turned away from the bargaining table and embarked on a campaign to align member firms and business community, the U.S. government, and the public around his target outcome. The deployment of new information technologies to help unclog busy ports. The result was an agreement that was ultimately mutually beneficial. Designing and executing a negotiation campaign involves identifying the relevant parties, grouping them into fronts according to shared interests, determining whether to combine fronts, if, for instance, doing so would unite your allies, and deciding which fronts to approach early on and which to engage only after you've made progress elsewhere. The deal between the PMA, Pacific Maritime Association, and the longshoremen involve high stakes but many small scale deals, such as gaining approval for a new product, also play out on multiple fronts. Going straight to a key decision maker often makes sense, but in many cases, a multi front campaign is the only way. Alrighty, so it's good they started with the case study. Multi, what is it called? Pacific Maritime Association and longshoremen. Alright, so most big deals. So basically, what it said was that some deals, basically big deals, have a lot of small components, definitely, that you need to be aware of, and then you have to see what would basically unite your allies, and that's a very big thing, and the timing of that it's also very big. You maybe want to only mention a deal a to a business partner or something when it's just the beginning of the deal. But for another person, you want to show it to them when everything's about to settle in. People are different, so it depends very much on that. I agree. Most big deals are built on a series of smaller ones. That's true of mega mergers, major sales, infrastructure projects, and even some UN resolutions. These deals are the culmination of many focused negotiations among various parties, each with its own concerns. Most deal making advice addresses how to choose the right tactics for each piece of the puzzle. Absent from the literature is guidance on how best to put the pieces together, let alone how to identify them in the first place. This leaves a glaring gap. Considering the case of Mittal Steel's takeover of Arcelor, Europe's largest steel company, an intricate deal ultimately worth 33.1 billion. Suppose that founder Lakshmi Mittal had simply set up a meeting with Arcelor's chief executive to hammer out an acquisition. However persuasive Mittal's pitch, Arcelor would have rebuffed it. Indeed, the company's board and CEO were, according to numerous accounts, dead set against the sale at first. Instead, Mittal and his son, Aditya, the firm's CFO, undertook what we call a negotiation campaign, involving multiple financial agreements, extensive shareholder and political dealings in Luxembourg, France, and Netherlands, and Canada, and regulatory accords in Brussels and Washington. These separate negotiations allowed Mittal to build sufficient support to overcome and even convert potential blockers. Okay, so basically they involved more parties and they made it more public. So they probably leveraged the credibility of Arcelor somehow. And they went from there. I probably need more information on this. The metal deal involved high stakes, but many small scale deals play out on multiple fronts as well. The champion of a new product, for instance, has to orchestrate complex internal negotiations across individuals and departments in order to secure support and senior executive approval. Founders of a new venture must weave a web of mutually reinforcing deals, raising money on the right terms from the right sources, persuading credible figures to join the board, forging agreements with critical employees, working out contracts with strategic partners, and so on. Weave a web of mutual reinforcing deals, raising money, and that. Each component deal in these situations presents a tactical challenge at the table. This kind of direct negotiation is familiar, trained to deal makers. Less familiar is how to address the more strategic challenge that unfolds away from the table. Sequencing the individual component deals in a way that allocates scarce negotiation efforts toward achieving the target outcome with enough support to make it stick. We have come to think of the process as a campaign, frequently conducted on multiple fronts, each typically involving many parties. On the basis of an analysis and experience advising dozens of complex deals and drawing on insights from sales, marketing, political, and even military campaigns, we have developed concepts and tools to keep executive conduct such campaigns. In this article, we lay out the process, offering advice on how to identify the relevant parties, define and sequence the fronts, and orchestrate the complex set of deals that build a winning coalition. But first, to illustrate what we mean by multi-front campaign and the limitations of direct negotiation, we'll describe what happened when port operators on the U.S. Pacific coast faced the longshoremen from a position of weakness. The story draws on various sources, especially a Harvard Business School case written by Kathleen McGinn and Dina Witter. While labor disputes such as this can be politically polarizing, the Pacific Maritime Association's multi-front approach incorporated many useful principles for overcoming daunting barriers and negotiating agreements that can ultimately be beneficial for all parties. Even small-scale deals play out on multiple fronts. The champion of a new product, for instance, has to orchestrate complex internal negotiations. Showdown on the waterfront. The PMA represents 72 U.S. and global shipping lines, including the behemoths Maersk, and Hanjin, along with terminal operators in ports from San Diego to Seattle. The organization traditionally held contract negotiations every 3 years with the International Longshore and Warehouse Union ILWU. When Joseph Manias became the PMA's president, his priority for the 1999 talks was an agreement to introduce new information technologies that would help overcome the paralyzing inefficiencies of clogged West Coast ports. At the bargaining table, however, Manias's efforts crashed into potent union opposition. to anything that might lead to future job loss. Even if the agreement guaranteed current jobs, this pushback from organized labor was understandable. Containerization and other technological changes had slashed the ILW's West Coast ranks by roughly 90% since the 1950s. Wielding its power over U.S. seaborne trade flowing through the West Coast, then worth some $6 billion a week, the Union began an informal slowdown. Loaded container ships soon backed up in harbors, disrupting supply chains. Pressure on the PMA and the Union to make a deal from companies such as Walmart, Dell, Home Depot, Nissan, and Boeing, which all depended on ocean shipping for parts and products from agriculture interests whose produce would quickly spoil, and from the government. The PMA, a fragmented organization of both huge and minor shipping players, quickly caved. Looking ahead to the 2002 contract talks, Miniace was resolved to reintroduce technology issues in order to address port congestion, which was only getting worse. But he worried about the ILWU's response. As labor expert Howard Kimmeldorf has said, in terms of economic muscle, the ILWU may be the strongest union in the country. Its members' compensation reflected the long-term results of this bargaining power. By 2002, annual wages for union members, including overtime, averaged 83,000 for longshoremen, and 118,000 for clerks, and 158,000 for foremen. What is a foreman? What is a foreman? I see. So basically, a foreman is a manager on the site, I believe. Pause for a moment to consider the negotiation advice you would offer Minias. Standard suggestions might include active listening, persuasion, trust building, putting oneself in the other party's shoes, starting with no, deciphering body language, inventing win-win options, and locking them in a room until they agree. While effective in many situations, such tactics would prove pathetically inadequate in the face of the ILW's credible threat to shut down $6 billion worth of U.S. foreign trade a week. So this time, Minias took a different approach to boosting the PMA's weak position. Well in advance of the 2002 talks, he embarked on a forefront campaign. Its effect was to set the stage so that the longshoremen would ultimately view a yes to Minias's technology proposal as better than a no. Front 1, internal. Minias focused on his organization first, visiting and patiently educating the PMA's shipping firm members on the importance of new technologies, and sometimes bringing pressure from major retailers and manufacturers. Thus Minias got PMA agreement to restructure and shrink its board to include fewer labor relations executives who were invested in smooth contract negotiations, and more operating executives who were focused on the economic consequences of repeated concessions. The PMA also agreed to change the board's decision-making procedures, moving from a consensus model to a voting model in which votes would be weighted according to shipping tonnage. Thus, the biggest players would have the most influence. Front 2, business. So front 1 was your internal. Basically, Minias focused on his organization first. I didn't get what the relation is. Maybe I'm reading this too fast. Minias. Hmm. Minius became. Oh, Minius. That's the and ILWU is the International Longshore Warehouse Union. Okay, and Joseph Minius is the president of PMA. So internal. The PMA also agreed to change the board's decision-making procedures, moving from a consensus model to a voting model in which votes would be weighted according to shipping tonnage. Thus, the biggest player would have the most influence. All right. Joseph Minius, the president, then coordinated closely with Robin Lanier, who had built many close ties as the president of the International Mass Retail Association. She brought the case to shippers, large importers, manufacturers, and retailers such as Walmart, whose input had been helpful on the internal PMA front. Those parties had a natural, though previously untapped, interest in the negotiations. The new technology would reduce total shipping time and permit more accurate cargo tracking. So they were eager to press for measures to increase the efficiencies of port operations. All right. Government. Okay, so Minius. Many close that. So he made some close ties to International Mass Retail Association. She brought the case large importers, manufacturers, and retailers such as Walmart, whose input had been helpful on the internal PMA front. Those parties had a natural through previously untapped interest in negotiations. The new technology would reduce. Okay, so they brought in. I believe they brought in some new technologies. All right, so government. The president went after the government. Next, Minius and his team arranged visits to the U.S. Departments of Commerce, Treasury, Labor, Transportation, and Homeland Security, and to the Office of the United States Trade Representative. He did not ask for favors. Rather, he pointed out how severe the economic impact of the 1999 union slowdown had been. In the event of a similar move by the ILWU, he said the PMA would not settle. Instead, it would shut down the ports. All right, so the public. Finally, the PMA took the public relations initiative to frame its message to the media and wider public. One thing, so I understand what is, let's see if PMA is still around. PMA. Pacific Maritime Association. It's a non-profit. What is it? Non-profit. Representing the world's leading shipping lines and terminal operators. On behalf of its member, this is actually crazy. Like, just look at this. PMA negotiates and administrates the maritime labor agreements with the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. All right. This is interesting. All right. Okay. A restructured board. It's a non-profit, and it does $6 billion worth a week of moving things around, just importing and exporting things. It's interesting to me. A restructured board, energized business and political allies. A targeted PR initiative put the PMA in a far stronger position. During the talks, the union initiated another slowdown, and the PMA responded with the promised port shutdown. President George W. Bush believed he had sufficient backing to invoke the emergency provisions of Taft-Hartley Act, the federal law governing the activities of labor unions for the first time in more than 30 years. This forced both parties back to work. Effectively, bluntly, the ILW used weapon and raising the cost of saying no. Old school tales of labor negotiations often emphasize table pounding principles locked in a room until they reach a deal. New Age versions emphasize trust building and careful listening. Here, menaces away from the table, sequential campaign on several fronts made the difference. As the lead union negotiator ruefully observed, it used to be that the negotiation took place at the table. The PMA's campaign was a forceful one, but the organization tried to avoid a purely coercive approach since the parties would have to live together. Ultimately, with the assistance of federal mediators, the parties negotiated a mutually beneficial agreement that gave technology rights to the shippers and jurisdiction over new technology jobs to union members, and guaranteed current union jobs. In an unprecedented affirmation of the New Deal, the two sides agreed to a 6-year rather than a 3-year term. The PMA and the ILWU uneventfully negotiated another 6-year deal in 2008. By 2010, both employment and tonnage through West Coast ports had shot up from 2002 levels by almost 40%. If you're negotiating with a politician, you might want to reach major donors. If you're dealing with a CEO, you could look to big customers. Ooh, interesting. This is interesting. Okay. When and why to choose a campaign? I don't know how this works, but when is a campaign likely to be more effective than direct negotiation? To answer that question, you need to whatever. You need to identify your target outcome and then assess any barriers that stand in your way. These often include negotiation weakness. For instance, you have a poor no deal option, but the other side can walk away without losing much. Too little value in the deal and opponents who could block an agreement. How would a campaign help overcome the barriers you've identified? Would it make your desired outcome more likely by building up useful alliances, enhancing your credibility, increasing the value you bring to the table, strengthening your no-deal option, weakening that the other side, or thwarting potential blockers? Will you need to negotiate approvals or buy-in? Say, securing key contracts or distribution rights before you even reach the main table. If the answer to any of those questions is yes, proceed with the campaign. What was it again? How would a campaign help overcome the barriers you've identified? Would it make your desired outcome more likely by building up useful alliances, enhancing your credibility, increasing the value you bring to the table, strengthening your no-deal option, weakening that of the other side, or thwarting potential blockers? Okay, if the answer to any of these questions is yes, proceed with the campaign. In the PMA case, it was time for a different approach, replaying the failed direct negotiation of 1999 in the 2002 talks without shoring up the shipper's weak position would probably have led to the same poor outcome, because the same high barriers would have stood in the way. Designing and executing a campaign. There are 6 steps to reaching your target deal and building a winning coalition that can make it stick. Choose the right parties and group them into fronts. Given the barriers to agreement that you've identified, what parties must or could usefully be involved? And how should you group them into more manageable fronts? In some cases, the answers are reasonably clear. Consider Boeing's campaign to sell $11 billion worth of 787 Dreamliners and other planes to Air India in late 2005. To succeed, Boeing needed to negotiate support from internal divisions and executives, strike deals with banks, export promotion agency, and aircraft leasing companies, and reach agreements with the Indian government, which has an ownership stake in the airline. On the sourcing of domestic content from Indian manufacturers, on the sourcing of domestic content from Indian manufacturers and the creation of local maintenance and pilot training organization. Thus, Boeing's campaign had to orchestrate negotiations on internal corporate fronts, external financial fronts, and political and national fronts. But identifying parties and fronts isn't always so straightforward. As with the PMA campaign, the useful players. Okay, I didn't quite get this last part. On the source of domestic content from Indian manufacturers and the creation of local maintenance and pilot training organizations. Thus, Boeing's campaign had to orchestrate negotiations on internal corporate fronts, external financial fronts, and political and national fronts. But identifying parties and fronts isn't always so straightforward. As with the PMA campaign, and the useful players may not be obvious at the outset. In Menees's 1999 talks, he made the conventional assumption about whom to involve this party and the one on the other side of the table. Yet figuring out the most advantageous set of parties for the 2002 talks, retailers, manufacturers, agriculture interests, federal agencies, and the broader public, as well as PMA members, required creativity and initiative. The sidebar finding the right parties for a Chinese campaign described the disciplined process by which the Hong Kong and China Gas Company identified the Volta of parties necessary to negotiate its many mainland Chinese joint ventures. Mapping backward from your target deal is a useful tool for discovering. Mapping backward from your target deal is a useful tool for discovering who must be involved or could be of use. So, for instance, you could consider your target's major influences. If you're negotiating with a politician, you might want to reach major donors. If you're dealing with a CEO, you could look to big customers. You'll also want to seek out potential allies who can provide useful resources or information, players who might present credible alternatives to your target deal, and so on. Probe each party's interests and perceptions, key formal and informal relationships, and constituencies, and no deal options. A previous HBR article, Harvard Business Review, offer more tools for this type of analysis. You'll then want to determine if and how to group the parties. As with the Boeing Air Canada's case, a front may comprise groups that are of a similar kind or class or from sectors or locations, bank debt holders, for example, or Brussels regulators. They may be organizationally related, staffs from government agency or corporate units of a target acquisition. They may share key interests or maintain tight relationships, environmental NGOs, or members of a family that has a controlling corporate interest. Although a front can consist of a single important party, It will more often be a collection of parties that can be grouped according to common interests or affiliation. Assess interdependencies among fronts. Are the fronts you've assembled largely independent, or can they positively or negatively affect one another? For example, is provincial agreement at both corporate and political levels helpful for financial negotiations? If a potential ally or blocker becomes aware of your activities on another front, will it help or hurt your overall prospect? If you deploy negotiating resources on one front, will that limit what you can deploy elsewhere and so on? So choose the right parties and group them into fronts. That's the grouping. Assess interdependencies among fronts. Determine whether and when to combine fronts. In complex situations with a large number of fronts, dealing separately with each one may be an effective way to organize your team's efforts, but it may make sense to keep fronts separate only at the outset and combine them once you've made sufficient progress on each. Combining fronts may generate gains from package deals in which success on a single front yields a resource such as capital, intellectual property, a valuable customer, a powerful ally that is worth most when combined with other similar resources. At the same time, combining fronts can inadvertently unite your opponents. When Conoco tried to establish consensus over building a pipeline in Ecuador's Amazon region, it negotiated on several fronts. One was composed of Ecuadorian and international advocates for indigenous peoples. Another consisted of environmental NGOs. Both opposed Conoco's plans but mainly acted independently. However, when Conoco arranged a consensus-seeking meeting of all stakeholders in a floating hotel on a river in the Amazon, the two groups combined forces in even more formidable opposition to Conoco, which ultimately withdrew from the project. By contrast, in the late 1990s, U.S. Trade Representative Charlene Barshevsky made a point of scheduling joint events for music, film, and software industry reps who had traditionally operated independently in order to unite the formerly separate players as allies behind her push for intellectual property negotiations with China. In general, keep fronts separate where there is little or no interdependence among them, when there has not been sufficient progress on each, when they might negatively affect one another, or when joining them might create an opposing bloc. Combine fronts when it's important for transparency. When success on separate fronts can yield joint gains, and when doing so unites your allies. Timing is key because progress on one front may help set up progress on the next. In the shippers longshoreman case, for example, gaining the support of important business players greatly strengthened the PMA's hand as it sought the backing of government agencies and the president. Um, yeah, I feel like we have time. Sequence your campaign. Just as knowing which parties to approach in what order within a front can make or break a deal, so can smart sequencing among fronts. When the probability or value of success on one front is greatly enhanced by success elsewhere, focus elsewhere first. If a deal with a critical partner is conditional on your having locked in financing, for instance, concentrate first on the financial front. Proper sequencing may also send important signals. Lining up a highly reputed lead investor, a well-regarded anchor tenant, or a big-name donor early in your campaign greatly increases the likelihood that other investors, satellite tenants, or smaller donors will come on board quickly and on favorable terms. Again, mapping backward is useful in the run-up to the make or break congressional vote on the North American Free Trade Agreement. News would arrive in the office of Bill Daley, President Bill Clinton's key strategist on the pact, that a member of Congress who had been leaning towards yes had come out as a no. Daley's response: can we find the guy who can deliver the guy? We have to call the guy who calls the guy who calls the guy. To help a client prepare for a financial transaction, we mapped backward from the target CEO to the CFO who had earned the CEO's trust, and to an analyst who had great credibility with the CFO and whom we had earlier prepped intensively. This made it much easier to get an agreement from the CEO, who immediately turned to the CFO, who in turn asked the analyst, who was already on board. Optimal sequencing decisions may defy conventional wisdom. Take, for example, the advice to get your allies on board first. When Secretary of State James Baker was trying to build a global anti-Iraq coalition after Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, many saw Israel as America's strongest regional ally. Yet Israel was pointedly excluded. Its formal membership would have kept numerous Arab states from joining. Baker and his team avoided this by treating Israel as a tacit member of the coalition and discouraging direct Israeli retaliation against Saddam's Scud missiles. Similarly, when preparing to negotiate on external fronts, okay, first of all, I was looking for more business-related, finance-related deals, like more specific, more crystal clear. But this is pretty good so far. So yeah, sometimes reading these articles and just like knowing them, the reason for these articles is to produce action. And basically, and produce action that hopefully it's something unintuitive to you, something you're not seeing, something, and you just need to maybe test the principles for yourself in a playground, in a deal you don't care, in an interview you don't care, or whatever, and then see what happens. It's really important to see what happens, and have those really key important data points, because first of all, yes, it's true. You can't have this wisdom and like this knowledge coming from someone else, but I don't know. A guy trusts himself more than anyone else and his gut. So sometimes you gotta just punch your gut by doing the unconventional thing and gaining that experience. Just weird it out if it's needed. That's what I'm thinking. That could be it, because if you just see the difference of the guy who made it work and the guy who didn't. The guy who made it work was the weird, crazy guy, and wasn't following just the intuition of God. The crazy, weird guy goes and see the opposite side as well. Take action, produce its own information, probably then act on whatever situation it is or scenario it is. So that's my 2 cents so far. This is not very financial, but good enough so far. Good enough. Only after this external success did the Bush administration turn to the internal U.S. Congressional Front for authorization. Had Bush and Baker tried first to gain approval to use force from a deeply skeptical Congress, they would have almost certainly failed, which would have hobbled any subsequent American led coalition building enterprise. The external coalition and UN votes were crucial in getting Congress on board. Common sequencing instincts may also lead you astray for other reasons. For example, when Steve Perelman was getting WebTV up and running, he faced multiple fronts: financial, content provider, distribution, and manufacturing, and so forth, on which he could focus his small team negotiating resources. With his venture running on financial fumes, many urged the obvious that he focuses on venture capital firms, angel investors, and industrial partners. Unfortunately for the nascent enterprise, nascent startup, those potential funders were deeply skeptical of consumer electronic investments. Instead of a direct approach, therefore, Perlman mapped backward from his aggressive target financial deal. He reasoned that WebTV's value would skyrocket if he could gain the support of at least one prominent consumer electronics firm. So he turned his attention to Sony and Philips, and once he had completed the difficult deals to get those gains on board, he redirected his efforts on the financial front and negotiated for much more VC money on far more advantageous terms than he could have secured earlier. With this new money, Perelman laid an intricate path of supporting agreements through the remaining fronts, including wholesale and retail distribution channels, content providers, ISPs, and alliance partners abroad. Unexpectedly, what Perelman viewed as a long-term negotiation campaign quickly reached a finale when Bill Gates expressed keen interest and Perelman negotiated the sale of his thriving young business to Microsoft. So what happened to WebTV? Steve Perelman. Well, you don't get the full picture from looking at the guys. Okay, here we go. QuickTime, WebTV, OnLive, PCell. Okay, so maybe not right time to search up Perelman. But okay, let's quickly move on. Secrecy or hints of backroom dealings, while sometimes tactically useful, may undercut a campaign's legitimacy. Fair enough. So don't go and stab someone in the back. The optimal sequence in a campaign depends on the nature of the dependencies among fronts. Focus earlier on a front when success at that stage is required for later progress or when it sends a positive signal. Takes advantage of difference of influence among parties or strengthens your later position. But early success may also come at the cost of much greater value later on. An early failure may preclude subsequent success. These points only scratch the surface of what is required for effective campaign sequencing decisions. For more detailed advice, see our suggestions for additional reading. Determine how much information to share and when. Your sequencing choices often determine the extent to which you reveal your activities to opponents or to various fronts. For example, you'll want it to be widely known if a savvy investor has signed in, just as obviously you'll want to be guarded about a failure to sign up a player known for his astute business instincts. Public perception of the negotiation process can matter. Secrecy of, or hints of backroom dealings, while sometimes tactically useful, may undercut a campaign's legitimacy. For example, when the president of Honduras insisted on keeping secret an agreement on a major forestry project with Stone Container, he fueled suspicious of dirty dealings. This energized widespread opposition on several fronts: political, labor, business, and environmental, and ultimately derailed an investment that promised huge economic and environmental gains for the impoverished Central American country, Honduras. For some activities, such as fundraising efforts, you'll want to be quiet until you have key pledges in hand. Revealing your interim results may then generate momentum or a sense of inevitability. In other settings, an apparent bandwagon can persuade willing allies to join and intimidate those who might oppose you if your campaign appeared vulnerable. In situations where information might mobilize opponents or opportunists, be discreet until you've locked in substantial progress. A classic example involves the challenge of assembling enough parcels for a major real estate development. If word leaks about the same status of individual negotiations, the risk of costly holdouts can skyrocket. Learn and adapt. Campaign design and execution decisions are inherently iterative. We've listed the steps sequentially, but throughout the process, new information will surface. Your counterparts will react to events, and alignments and circumstances may change. You need to continually evaluate where you are and be prepared to update your strategy and tactics. The right mindset for an effective negotiation campaigner is to think strategically but act opportunistically. From single deals to campaigns, most negotiation scholars and popular handbooks focus on the individual deal as the unit of analysis. They probe communication patterns, tactical choices, and factors that influence the outcome of a direct approach, such as gender or culture. A negotiation campaign also calls for these analytic and behavioral skills, but only as element of a broader strategic approach. When the unit of analysis shifts from one deal to a multi-front campaign, the focus turns from tactics at the table toward a process that may unfold over months or years. Going straight to a key decision maker to negotiate often makes good sense, yet designing and executing a negotiation campaign can sometimes be far more effective in many cases. It's the only way. Okay. Recommend that for you. This is good. So I'm just gonna go over the headlines. Fortunately, I have to be done by 7:30. So we went to Menes and him negotiating with the basically the ILWU, basic international union, the union, international ILW, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, and he basically did a few things. He worked internally on the business, on government, the public, and then we moved to how to set up a campaign, basically, because you have multi fronts, you need to have a campaign. I'm not sure what a campaign is, honestly, but let's just kind of think we know. Assess interdependencies among fronts, figure out if they are related, time out if they are, determine whether and when to combine fronts. All right, sequencing your campaign. I see. And determine how much information to share and when. And then learn and adapt. So basically, your secrets are important. Your timing is important. Um, Being ready for unexpectables is important. I actually feel like so much lighting here now. Holy God, I look much better. Um, that's important. What else is important? Um, the behind the wall tactics, right? Because it can undermine the legitimacy of your deal, because you're probably hiding something, and it could be tactically useful. But when you're hiding something, people I feel like everyone tend to just think of the worst situation because they rather prepare for the worst, right? It kind of makes sense if you're hiding something. What else? Yeah, that's good enough. I will try to read more from HBR Harvard Business Review and also Stanford, maybe Wharton, I don't know. Prison experiment, business, publish, I don't know, newspaper, newsletter. Do they even have that? They do have that. The Stanford Business A/B testing gets an upgrade for the digital age. This is just for the school. And yeah, I feel like our best bet is Wharton. The next best bet is Wharton. Business Review. Knowledge at Wharton. Yeah, I think this, and let me just double check. Stanford Business Insights by Stanford Business. Okay. Yeah, these will be probably some good compilation of business news. Alrighty, so thank you for watching this, and hopefully we'll have a technical video for the next